Hello everyone, it's me, Paata Shamugia, poet and president of Penn, Georgia. Today we have a great event called Poetry Now, which is organized by the Writers' House of Georgia, and I'm honored to host today two great contemporary poets, Charles Bernstein and Michael Palmer. Very familiar for every poetry lover. But anyway, it's a formal part of the event, so I should do it. Michael Palmer is an American poet and translator. His honors include 2 grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Writers Award, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, the Shelley Memorial Prize from the Poetry Society of America, and he was awarded the 2006 Wallace Stevens Award. In 1999, he was elected as a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. Charles Bernstein is the founder and member of Language Poets Avant-Garde Group. He's the author or editor of over 50 books, ranging from full-length collections of poetry and essays to pamphlets and collaborations. Bernstein is a professor of English and comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's co-director of Penn Sound. He's a fellow of American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2015, Bernstein was awarded both the Münster Prize for International Poetry and Janus Pannonius Grand Prize for Poetry. Welcome to both.
Thank you.
I have not seen you for a long time, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk to you again. Thank you once again. I think we can start the conversation. Just to remind you, we will talk about several issues, and then at the end of the discussion, we will read a few poems. Dear Charles, can we start, dear Charles?
Yeah.
We hosted you at Tbilisi Internet. Yeah.
Good to be back with you, Paata, and the Writers' House. I had such a fantastic visit, and with my wife Susan, it's still absolutely breathtaking in my memory. Such wonderful people that I met, and I love the place. So it's great to be with you, even if remote.
Thank you. Yeah, it was in 2018, and then it was followed by Michael's visit in 2019. And it's not an exaggeration to say that your visit gained amazing feedback for the festival. And the question is, how much has changed since your meeting with Georgian audience?
You know, it's hard for me to answer that, as your introduction said I was a professor, but now I am a retired professor. So that has changed. I've stopped teaching since that time. And of course, the COVID and the combination with the Trump Republican control has changed things in the external environment. And I think the poetry has responded to some degree to that. I think that there's been a lot of shifting, sometimes explicit and sometimes not, in respect to the climate overall. But you know, the thing is that, I don't know, Michael's actually just slightly older than me. I see Michael there, and he's so I can't help but feel I'm talking to him too, even though we're talking to George. You know, I met Michael when I was in my mid-20s. I used to stay at his house in San Francisco. It was very generous, in a basement room. I think it was a basement, but something like that. Those were great times. I think a lot of my understanding of poetry came out of that moment in the 70s and the 80s, and then teaching over the next 20 years. And I'm still very much involved in that, and actually, not surprising for an older person, maybe reading a lot of older things that I never got around to before, or rereading. So for me, the change is to some degree in my mood, my time, and my reading, and trying to expand further and further. So after I went to Georgia, of course, I got your wonderful book.
Thank you.
And read that, in the English translations. I think he even talked to you about some of those translations, so that interested me a lot. And then you referred to other people. I can't say I know that much about Georgian poetry, but I knew more. And I think that this is more, my life has been more outside of the US. But I think the United States is, it's a very closed environment. It's gigantic, but too much of the poetry and too many of even the political issues are framed too much in terms of the US. And my sense of my life as a poet is less US centered as I can be. And I'm in touch with people, you know, all in many different countries doing translations and reading their work. So for me, I'm interested in that kind of non-nation centric world of poetry and the kind of affinities that allow us three to be here, because I think there's a lot of ways that the three of us, Paata, Michael, and me are connected. This kind of affinity, I would say, non-national affinity, you know, more so than most of the poets in New York, most of the poets in San Francisco or in the US. And those kinds of connections are what matters to me now. But it takes a lifetime to determine what they are and to sort of chart them and recognize them. I don't know if that actually answers your question, but.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Dear Michael, how much has changed since our last meeting? The same question to you.
Well, it is interesting because, of course, habits of daily life, once we were quarantined, so to speak, with the virus, habits of daily life were radically changed. And I've thought a lot about what that's done. In some ways, writers work at home at their desk anyway, read, write, work. And so there's an aspect of my life that hasn't changed at all. We have our professional obligations that are met more. I work with a dance company, for example, so we're doing a virtual event, and that means a lot of communication by Zoom, and a lot of other communication by Zoom as well in my own life as a writer. But I found that as this thing has extended, I've become, first of all, more aware simply of mortality. There's a lot of time to sit around and think. And as an older person, I am susceptible to the serious consequences. We've always known that, but we never believe it, unfortunately, from day to day. Now I believe it, and I've watched a lot of friends die through the year, not to be morbid, but some of COVID, others just of various things of old age, artists, musicians, etc. And so that's put me very much in touch with the passage of time. And likewise, in daily life, the passage of time from morning to midnight. That brings us around to the fact that the poem I will read is from a series of poems that I began early on in the lockdown called Midnights, because I would tend to begin to work somewhere around 11:30 at night till even 1 in the morning. And these poems started coming to me. And I thought, well, that's perfect. This is the quiet, the silence of the night that I can fill with poems. That continues in a way that it never has in my life before. And there are now maybe 40, 45, 50 of those poems, 45 probably. So that's been an interesting shift in my practice. And I've written these things with a great deal of freedom, freedom of tone, freedom of form, just let it go, so to speak. And they're, I suppose you'd call them improvisations, though nothing is entirely an improvisation, so structured improvisations. Then as to personal life, we've been cut off from, for example, my daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren, where we'd normally be visiting with them, have time with them in the summer. All of that has been impossible. So different relationship, but sometimes a sort of intense longing for old friends and for family in ways that on a day-to-day basis, you don't have with the same intensity. Charles and I have a number of things in common. But he touches on one of them, which is internationalism. We both have been committed for a long, long time in a way that is uncharacteristic of many Americans to international company. I think that's one reason that we both had such an extraordinary experience being in Georgia at the festival there, which is international in its scope and perspective. And after that, I went to Paris for a conference about the great American poet Robert Duncan, which was also international in scope. So we do have that in common, and we're committed to translation, to exchange, to overcoming nationalistic boundaries and bigotries. So that's the implicit, in a way, politics of our practice, to say no to nationalism, no to, well, virtually everything that Trump represents, of course. We are now, our nervous systems are hyperactive right now because we have a few days until the election next Tuesday. And it's an election, not to exaggerate, for the soul of democracy. And so all of these questions of international relations extending beyond poetry, but certainly involving poetry, are very, very much at issue now, as we see the horrendous isolationism of a man like Trump and his followers and flunkies. So,
okay, well, we can continue and expand this coronavirus pandemic topic. Well, unfortunately, as we know, a lot of people lost their lives, but we can't talk about it today because we are not experts in this field. But my question still will be related to literature intermingled with pandemic. How has the corona pandemic affected your personal productivity? For example, Charles, many people think that nothing has changed for poets because poetry is something, an isolated activity. But can we say that it will help literature in any way?
That's quite the twist at the end. Help, I don't know.
Yeah.
Change,
but was it? Yeah.
Change, yes, and change can be for the good and bad, and it's certainly true that catastrophes call upon inner resources and bring about good things. But I always would say about that it's nobody would pay that price with anybody dying or of this terrible circumstance, which of course affects people who are, the poorer they are, and in the United States, African Americans and Latinos, people. So it's who gets affected is so much reflects the economic system in globally, but in the United States, nothing good comes of that. But will good things come of the tragedy? Well, I mean, one thing you might just say is that maybe people will wake up, although I'm not convinced that they will. I mean, the pandemic has a kind of metonymic or a relationship with other human, non-human interactions on the globe, and in that sense might help us to be aware that we have, that the earth can't live with it, can't live without it, that we have to take into account climate change and sustainability of food and these kinds of political issues. And I think a lot of young people are very aware of it. I mean, when Michael's slightly older than me once again, but it makes a big difference in this point because I was born in 1950. Michael just after the end of the Second World War, and I think that is
1943.
Yeah, 43 years after, and I think that 7 years is a big difference. But for a number of reasons having to do with the war in the 50s. But we still will both remember that in the 50s, we were all concerned about, atomic annihilation. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of poets, ban the bomb, and again, nuclear disarmament, which, by the way, still remains a very important question. And we were concerned. And also we had the model of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the extermination of the European Jews and all the rest wasn't so far closer to when Michael was born, which I think does make a difference. And in that very tranquilized 50s. And now I think young people are aware of the global situation, and that makes, however, one of the things that goes on in poetry is that, and this is my poem is a little bit about that, to express the fact that you're against global warming, you're against poverty, against inequality, against racism, does not necessarily grapple with how poems can take on that world. There are sentiments that I agree with, but poems do something different. I think going back to, so that was just the answer to your last, is there kind of, I use the term deficit gain now. There's always a gain when bad things happen, but you wouldn't choose that. And perhaps things would have been better had they not happened. I don't think that poetry is an isolated activity. It never have. And I'm mentioning that just because Michael and I are rarely together, and certainly I don't think ever together on tape. So, but I want to situate it in terms of talking to him because, he's in my screen, but I've known him for most of my writing life. He brought me when I was staying in his basement. Why he put me up as a late 20-year-old person he hardly knew, is an example of the kind of community and generosity that we were involved in. But he brought me to see Robert Duncan at the San Francisco State Poetry Center. Robert Duncan wrote a poem during my reading, which was one of my very first readings, probably 1978, and he gave it to me. For me, my writing life is involved with those kinds of very specific interactions, one person to another. It's always been involved with other people, through correspondence, through meeting people, with readings. It's true, a lot of people say that someone like me, I'm mostly at home, I'm mostly living in my head, I'm reading my books, I'm at my computer, I don't look up unless there's a fire or my wife comes and waves her hand and says, we're eating now, are you getting up? But I said, oh, really? But, and that is true, I do live that way, but nonetheless, my life is still intensely social. And it isn't just social in the way that's available to me in this time of COVIDity. And I feel, while I can go on and do a lot of the things, an immeasurable loss in not being able to walk down the street and interact with people in a casual way, in not going to readings. I have gone to museums, but with a very isolated place. Of course, I live in New York too, and New York's been very hit in terms of the theater, performance, gatherings, cafes. I mean, this is what, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. This is, to me, the lifeblood of poetry. My poetry comes out of those social interactions, even though 99% of my time I still spent sitting in this chair in particular, which goes back, by the way.
Yeah, maybe that was the point, that poets write in an isolated environment.
Well, many people think
they
that.
don't need anybody to.
And I think that is true of a lot of writers. You always imagine a novelist who goes to the country to write their novels. I just say, but that isn't my experience. So I try as much as I can to stay in touch with people through email. And through, I don't like Zoom. I like this talking in Zoom, but I don't like Zoom readings where you just see the one person reading and there's that not interaction. So I think it's a great toll. I also feel lucky in this way to be older, where my life, I've had so much go on up until the first 70 years that I can draw upon that during these years. I don't know how I would feel if I was younger and having to have this loss, this gap. But I would emphasize that it's much worse than we imagine, not better. Even those of us who are relatively well off and have comfortable rooms and food, and because the disconnection of the physical proximity of other poets and artists and people in the street does deprive us of really the lifeblood of our work. And the digital environment, or books too, as much as I love books, is not sufficient or not the same for me. And, but I have continued to write and to correspond and write letters, all the rest, and try to, do the best I can in the face of this loss. But I do think of it as loss.
Pandemic, we all are in the same boat right now, because we also have quite difficult health conditions across the country. But there is always something that is more dangerous than any virus. It is today's politics.
One other point about the COVID is that despite the enormous cultural differences and social differences and poetic differences, still the virus is the same. We're all in our own different ways confronting a similar biological threat, and that commonness is a non-national thing, and we can perhaps be brought together in terms of facing this common menace to our lives.
Yeah. Can't agree more. Yeah, we will elect a new parliament, by the way, after a few days, and we have no idea what consequences we will face. And you also have elections in the United States. So the question is, will Donald Trump still remain as a president, and how you see the foreseeable future of America? Michael, can you?
Well, at the moment, it looks reasonably favorable that Trump will be kicked out of office. But there are no guarantees. One of the curious phenomena, he's such a shameful person. He appeals to the worst human instincts. Therefore, polls are unreliable, because people will say that they would vote for his opponent, in this case, Joe Biden. But in fact, they won't be telling the truth. They're just ashamed to admit that they want Trump in office, carrying on with his racist policies and his anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic policies. So it's very, very hard to tell. We can only hope that what the polls are saying are accurate. What is at stake is, either this viciously reactionary, almost, neo-fascist is accurate, regime versus a sort of neoliberal regime that Biden will represent. Obviously, Biden is the more humane choice. He comes down much more strongly for them. He has the kind of decency that Trump utterly lacks. In terms of the arts, of course, Trump would never mention the arts, so I can't even read a sentence. But I've been struck that they are not, once again, not part of the discussion. And that goes for the Democrats and the Republican Party, absolutely off camera. This is not a surprise. We are an art of limited resources and limited readership. I don't complain about that, because it's always been my picture of what, if poetry had things to do that were resistant and critical and so on, you don't expect an enormous audience or enormous acclaim. Whenever someone like Charles or myself has actually won a prize, I've just been amazed, because I never even thought I'd get my books published when I was in my 20s. So we're grateful for what does come about, but we have to face the fact that unlike in some cultures, poetry doesn't really have a central role. I will make one exception here, which is And so the poetry of, let's say, the Harlem Renaissance on forward, but even before that, liberationist poetry and so on, played a key role in the formation of the African-American resistance and cultural growth in a way that is very different from the culture I mainly grew up in. It had a kind of necessity and a kind of directness of address, so to speak, that was very emotionally involving. We spoke of the sense of community that is interrogated, I think, by the isolation that we have. Charles spoke in his own way of that. I mean, one of the things my poetry has always tried to do is be a form of communication of a particular kind, addressing the other, embracing the other. And the midnights that I've been writing, I think because of this strange moment we're in, have been particularly emphasizing that aspect of my work. I've had all sorts of presences coming into the work. In particular, I'll read a poem at the end here that speaks of the poet Han Shan, who was a 6th century Chinese poet, who keeps arriving and giving me messages, so to speak, at midnight, and then I talk back. But then there have been many other people, and I realized it was a form of company across time, atemporal company, because poets have always had the luxury of speaking with Dante, for example. I mean, it's not as if you're just reading this distant, as a poet, you're not just reading this distant masterpiece. You are talking with Dante, let's say. How did you do that? How did your art come to be what it was? How did you bring together both a lyrical and a philosophical voice? We're always asking for help from such people. And likewise, Anshan, who was also known as Cold Mountain, Gary Snyder translated his work, but many other people have too. Likewise, you sort of ask a great ancient poet who lived a very nomadic, difficult life, how did you do that? How did you survive as a poet? How did you survive without making that much of what people call money? And so on. So it has intensified that sense of community and communication, but across time, across national boundaries, but also across time.
Yeah, but despite that fact, poetry is getting less and less popular. Less and less people read poetry for a variety of reasons. And Charles, what can we do to raise interest towards poetry?
Well, I think we can do exactly what what the four of us, Nukas in the background, are doing. I think that we are good examples of doing what can be done. I think that mediums like poetry, or genres, you call it a medium, respond to the cultural situation that they're in. And so I think that in the US context, a certain kind of aesthetic concern and centeredness, which Michael spoke of as being a non-presence within national politics a moment ago, but that very fact that we take as a given, has been a pretty consistent thing. I always think of Edgar Allan Poe as a sort of one of the most eloquent early voices of this problem when he writes in the Poetic Principle about the only interest is in didactic poems and moralizing poems. I think this has been an ongoing thing. I think there have been some exceptions, which we could talk about, some bursts of energy, but I think that there's a lot of suspicion of aesthetics and of the poetic, in the sense that anyway, Michael and I think you too, Paata, would share it. And I think this is what makes poetry so fundamental and powerful, within the US context. That yes, it's not a mass audience, but it is genuinely exploring something that's different. And I think, you know, sticking to that, not compromising, not trying to become popular, not trying to reach out, not dissipating the aesthetic force of the work, makes it something extremely powerful when people encounter it, as it was for us. And that is transformative, and that does happen, perhaps not on a mass scale, but on a significant scale. The other thing I think in terms of poetry is what we talked about earlier, the non-national focus, which I think is especially incumbent upon people in the US, not to be focused just on US history and its injustices, but world history and the many different frames of its injustice. And also, you can't know all the poetry in the world. Of course, you can't know all the poetry in Brooklyn, for that matter.
Yeah.
But to limit the time that you spend with the local, get deep with that, but also to at least deal in some fundamental committed way to some non-local things, because I think that there's the future of poetry, and American poetry is in the non-local. And I think the future of American and English language poetry is in people who are not from the US and England or Australia, not from dominant English countries, writing in English as a global language. We are in the middle of something which is happening, which is a lot like this conversation. A lot of stuff takes place in English. And the benefit of that can be to listen to the people who are not the apparently native English speakers, but the English writers, and to take that as the focus of what our poetic community is, and to see how a powerful infusion of energy is coming from non-English dominant places by people writing and thinking in English, and to listen to that and to try to articulate shapes with that. And that audience is huge. That audience is huge, rather than get caught up in readership issues within the US, for example.
Well, let's not forget the most important literary spotlight of the year, the Nobel Prize, which received American poet Louis Glick in this year. What do you think? What do you think influenced this decision? That was quite unexpected for the majority of humankind.
I have, you know, this is culture as opposed to art, this prize-giving thing. And I really never had any insight into what are the determining factors for a Nobel Prize in literature. I've had a number of friends over the years who have won them, deservedly so, from many different cultures. They've reacted in different ways. Some have, Octavio Paz, when Octavio won the prize, he was happy. He embraced it. He had a bank of phones which he was manning and talking to the press and so on. He's a very outgoing public writer. Let's contrast that with Sam Beckett, who for whom it was the catastrophe.
Yeah.
He ran off to Morocco, and the only quotation they have from him was these reporters chased him down in this little cabin in Morocco where he was staying on vacationing, and one of them said, "How are you, Mr. Beckett?" He came out on his porch reluctantly, and he said, "I'm fine." And that's the only recorded reaction, public reaction. So it's an odd business, and it depends on the nature of the work and the moment. I have no particular insight into why Louise received it this year. I'm sure she was quite surprised herself. Whereas other poets I know have expected it in a way, and when they got it, poets or prose writers, and when they got it, they thought, "Oh yeah, I knew it was coming." But no, I don't have any insight into those people, the judges.
Yeah. Well, great. It was very fruitful conversation. With your permission, in the end of this conversation, let's read a couple of poems.
Well, I had just one thought about
that.
I don't pay much heed to the Nobel Prize in literature, but and it's not, I don't think it's been a significant guide to what interests me. But I must say, with this year when it came up, I was surprised because I looked on Spotify and YouTube and I couldn't find any albums or songs by this new person. I was very confused by that.
I feel you. Okay. Okay, with your permission, in the end of this conversation, let's read a couple of your poems from your recent works in English and Georgian for the festival audience. I will read Georgians. First, you read the original poems, and I'll read the Georgian translations. So let's start it.
I can begin.
Okay.
Just to keep things moving.
Okay.
I think I'll read the slightly longer one, which is called Midnights Outside.
Outside, okay.
Because it mentions the great Chinese poet Han Shan, who I'd been having these conversations with. These Zoom across the centuries conversations during the COVID. And sorry. So we'll begin with that. Midnights Outside. Sometime after midnight, Han Shan came down once again from the mountain. Do you realize we have no tongue in common? He asked, innocently enough. So how is it we are speaking one with another? Or is it no one to no one across the countless dynasties, the infinite revolutions of the spheres and twilight murmurations? Speaking about that rag and bone shop, most foul of the heart's slowing clock, about the hangman's knot, speaking about the breath turn, the pause, about desire, about loss. In my time, I remember the empty universe was permitted, had its honored place, and stillness was the celebrated dance. In my time, remember, there were no midnights, no streetlights, no zoetropes or pantographs, no April in Paris, no suicides in room 309. So let us go then, you and I, to that place where there is no time. What were names after all when I was alive, when you and I were alive? Who was Cold Mountain after all? Who our blessed company? Last wolf and lost wolf howling at the drinking gourd, and who that friend Villon in tattered cloak amidst the snows? So let us go then, nameless, you and I, and find our way outside.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I read the same poem in Georgian. შუაღამეები, გარეთ. ერთხელ შუაღამის შემდეგ ჰან შანი კვლავ ჩამოვიდა მთიდან. ხვდები, საერთო ენა რომ არ გვაქვს იკითხა საკმაოდ გულუბრყვილოდ. ეს როგორ ხდება, რომ ველაპარაკებით ერთმანეთს უთვალავი დინასტიის განმავლობაში, სფეროთა უსასრულო აყერავების დროში და შებინდების წუწუნში, იმაზე რომ რეგენტ ბოუნის მაღაზია ყველაზე გულის წამღებად სუნიანია და ჯალათის ხულბზე ვლაპარაკობ და ვლაპარაკობ სუნთქვის შენელებაზე, პაუზაზე, სურვილზე და დანაკარგზე, ჩემს დროს გახსოვდეთ. ცარიელი სამყარო მიღებული იყო, მას ჰქონდა თავისი საპატიო ადგილი და უძრაობა იყო ცნობილი ცეკვა. ჩემ დროს გახსოვდეთ, არ იყო შუაღამეები, ქუჩის განათებები, ზოოტროპები ან პანტოგრაფები, არ იყო აპრილი პარიზში, არ იყო სუიციდი 309 ოთახში. მოდი წავიდეთ იმ ადგილას, სადაც დრო არაა. რა ერქვა ხალხს? მე როცა ცოცხალი ვიყავი, როცა მე და შენ ვიყავით ცოცხლები, ვინ იყო Cold Mountain-ი, ბოლოს და ბოლოს რა ერქვა ჩვენს ნეტარ კომპანიას? ბოლო მგელი თუ დაბოლილი მგელი, სასმელს რომ შეხვმოოდა და ეს მეგობარი გაცვეთილ მოსასხამში, თოვლის ფონზე, ვინ არის? მოდი წავიდეთ, შენ და მე, უსახელოები და გზა გარეთ ვეძიოთ.
Thank you.
Now, Charles.
Well, this poem is written from a couple of years ago, and it's called "The Darkness He Called Night." Virtue's a kind of despair, masquerading as care. A bitter current is for virtue sweet. Sublime wines sours its mouth. Snakes eat from its hands. Jackasses obey its whim. Self-nomination papers its path. Method is its MO, holding tight to a higher love and fervently displayed empathies. Virtue's sword is truth, in love with itself, at odds with others. Celebrating standards it fashions. Virtue jams miscreants, shams malcontents, shaming those abjure improvement. The passion of virtue is reprimand. Nothing is more beautiful to virtue than compelling justice and shattering dissent. Slashes in a pan that will never absolve aesthetics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the same poem in Georgian is translated, by the way, by Inga Zhrenti, a brilliant Georgian translator. I read it several times and it's really brilliant translation. Charles Bernstein. სათნოება ერთგვარი სასოწარკვეთილება, სიყვარული ჩენიღბული ტკივილის განს და მას სიხარულს ანიჭებს. საუცხო ღვინოს ის გემოს უწუნებს, მისი ხელებიდან გველები იზრდებიან, მის ახირებებს სულელები ემორჩილებიან, ცხოვრების გზა თვით მარქვიობით გაიკლია, ამაღლებულ სიყვარულს და მოჩვენებით პათეტიკურ ემპათიას, თელი ძალით ჩაბაღავჭებული კრიმინალური მეთოდებით modus operandi მოქმედებს. სათნოების მახვილი სიმართლეა თავის თავზე შეყვარებული, რომელსაც მხოლოდ სხვების წინააღმდეგ აღმართავს, ნორმების თაყვანისცემა შეგუებული, გასაქანს არაძლევს, არამზადებს, გმობს, მოწინააღმდეგეებს საბუჩად იგდებს, ცვლილებებს, სხვათა გმობა, მისი გაუნალებელი გატაცება, სათნოების თვალში ძალადობრივი სამართალი და მწვავე უთანხმოება, უმაღლესი მშვენიერება, იმ თარგზე იჭრება, რომელიც არასდროს წყალობს ესთეტიკას. Thank you. Thank you very much once again. It was great conversation, I think.
And wonderful to see all of you.
Yeah, we all missed you, by the way, and we sometimes, talked about this festival and
yes, never far from our thoughts. And I hope once all this madness is over, the festival will revive and we can move on.
Let us meet again soon. Wonderful to be with you for me this afternoon.
Thank you very much. You've been brilliant.